The first time the words appeared, they were not spoken aloud by anyone in the room, but written in black letters on an old mandated report hidden deep inside an electronic hospital record. Finish her if she talks. When the nurse Linda Carter glanced down and read those chilling words, her face drained of color. She looked at me, 20-year-old Maya Dawson, lying on the examination table for what should have been a simple ultrasound, and whispered with fear, "This line is in your file. You must be careful." I did not understand at first. I thought she had made a mistake. How could such a phrase appear in my medical history? Then she quietly explained that the note was attached years ago after a welfare check when neighbors suspected something was wrong in my home. My heart raced. My chest felt like it would burst. What kind of father left such words in a record that a nurse decades later would discover? I froze as the machine hummed beside me, and my mother, Evelyn Dawson, stood just outside the door, pressing the strap of her handbag like she was guarding a vault. She always wanted to be inside with me during appointments, but Dr. Alan Brooks had insisted on privacy, citing hospital policy. Evelyn hated rules that limited her control. That was my life. My parents, Richard and Evelyn, were respected in our Ohio town. To the outside world, they were model citizens. Richard Dawson, 52, was a contractor who built homes and donated to church events. Evelyn, 48, wore pearls and sat on boards of local charities. My brother Caleb, 28, worked with my father and was praised for his strength and discipline. Together, they were considered a pillar family. Yet behind closed doors, the Dawson household was a fortress of silence, fear, and bruises that never healed properly. I was the youngest, the obedient daughter who rarely spoke out because every time I did, my words came back to me with pain attached. That was the foundation of my childhood. On this day, the ultrasound should have been a symbol of hope. I was 6 months pregnant, a girl of 20, carrying a child that had been the subject of endless whispered accusations and cruel speculation inside my own home. My father demanded that DNA tests be attached to the medical record. He said it was to preserve the family name. The truth was, he wanted control of even the smallest detail of my body. The nurse did not just see measurements on a screen. She saw timelines, dates that did not align with the stories my family had forced me to tell. She saw notes from past injuries, files that did not match the official explanations. She saw that line, "Finish her if she talks," preserved in a mandated report. Her whisper was not a command. It was a warning. The past had claws, and it was reaching for me again. The shock of her words slammed into me harder than any blow I had received at home. For a moment, the room spun and I gripped the table. I thought of my brother Caleb and his eyes filled with casual cruelty. I thought of my mother Evelyn, who could deliver venom in a single sentence like, "You deserve everything you get." I thought of my father Richard, whose voice filled every corner of our house like a dictator in his palace. And now I realized those words were not just history. They were prophecy. If I told anyone the truth about what happened inside the Dawson home, if I revealed the violence, the control, the threats, then the promise of that line would come true. Finish her. Destroy her. Silence her forever. Yet something in me resisted. My chest still ached, but my mind started to sharpen. The foundation of fear that had been built under me for years was starting to crack because now there was proof outside the family circle. The nurse had seen it. The doctor had seen enough to separate my mother from me. A record existed, and if a record existed, then there was a chance for justice. For the first time in years, I felt a spark, not of terror, but of defiance. I kept my face neutral when Evelyn entered to collect me. She asked with fake sweetness, "Was everything fine?" I nodded. Inside, I was shaking, but I also knew something had shifted. The words, "Finish her if she talks," that were meant to terrify, became the reason I knew I had to talk. The story of the Dawson family looked perfect on the surface, but the cracks were widening. I left the hospital that day with two truths pressing on me. One, my family would never stop controlling me unless I acted. Two, I finally had allies outside the walls of Maple Ridge. My father, Richard, believed he had built an empire of silence, but I had just witnessed the first breach. It would not be the last. The perfect family portrait that the Dawsons displayed on the mantel in our Maple Ridge estate was a lie painted in expensive frames. To outsiders, Richard Dawson was a respected builder whose company sponsored local baseball fields and donated lumber for church repairs. Evelyn was the elegant wife who organized luncheons and wore pearls. Caleb, my older brother, was praised as hardworking and loyal to the family business, and I, Maya, was presented as the quiet daughter with a bright future. Yet inside those walls, the truth was ugly and violent. I grew up learning that silence was the safest answer. When I was 16, I once argued that I wanted to attend an art program out of state. Caleb slammed me into a wall so hard that my shoulder ached for weeks. My father watched and said with cold calm, "Let her learn discipline." My mother, Evelyn, added, "You embarrassed us by asking." That was their method. Caleb was the enforcer, Richard the commander, Evelyn the judge, and I was the prisoner. No one in town suspected because I smiled on command. Even when I carried bruises on my arms, I was told to wear long sleeves and claim sports injuries. The cracks in the foundation were visible only to me, but as I grew older, they widened. Richard's control extended to finances. Every dollar I earned from babysitting was taken and deposited into an account he monitored. Evelyn kept my phone locked in her desk, giving it back only for supervised calls. Caleb checked my laptop, scrolling through messages and deleting friends he did not approve. They justified everything with words like family honor and protection. To them, my independence was rebellion. My only escape was my friend Chloe Martinez. She lived 2 houses away and would pass notes through our shared fence. At 17, she whispered through the slats that my life was not normal. She promised that when we turned 18, we would find a way out together. But on my 18th birthday, Richard intercepted her message and accused me of betrayal. That night, Caleb pushed me onto the floor and kicked my side. Evelyn stood over me and said, "This is what happens when you shame us." I never forgot that sentence because it defined our relationship. Evelyn was not a protector. She was a co-conspirator. Still, the town saw perfection. At Sunday services, Evelyn led prayers while Richard greeted parishioners with firm handshakes. Caleb coached Little League and fathers praised him. Nobody knew that the same hands that guided children on a baseball diamond also shoved his sister against a wall. I tried to convince myself that maybe I was exaggerating, that maybe this was discipline, not cruelty. But the cracks grew deeper. At 19, when I first dated Ethan Cooper, a kind boy who dreamed of becoming a mechanic, Richard ordered Caleb to follow us. One night after Ethan dropped me off, Caleb grabbed my hair in the driveway and hissed, "You will not embarrass Dad with this loser." The next morning, Ethan stopped texting. I never heard from him again. Later, I learned Richard had visited his parents and threatened to ruin their business contracts if Ethan continued seeing me. That was the day I realized escape would not be simple. Richard's power extended into the community like the beams of the houses he built. He thought he owned me, just as he owned the land. The most frightening moment came 2 years ago when I ended up in the emergency room with a head injury. Neighbors had called welfare officers after hearing shouting. The official report said I fell down the stairs. The hidden note in my file, the one Linda Carter later discovered, contained the phrase, "Finish her if she talks." I never saw it then, but I felt the threat in every look Richard gave me. That phrase became a curse over my life. Now, at 20 and pregnant, the weight of that past pressed harder. My mother, Evelyn, still monitored everything, criticizing what I ate and what I wore. Caleb still loomed with casual menace. Richard still demanded obedience. The cracks were no longer hairline fractures. They were widening fissures. And I knew that if I stayed silent, the whole structure of my life would collapse and bury me inside. The public saw a proud family, but behind closed doors I was counting the bruises that told the true story. Those bruises were the cracks that betrayed the Dawsons' perfect facade, and each one pushed me closer to the moment I would finally resist. The trigger came not with a shout or a blow, but with the quiet tone of authority that only a doctor can carry when he knows something is wrong. Dr. Alan Brooks was in his 60s with steady hands and a reputation in Cedar Falls for honesty. After the ultrasound, he asked my mother Evelyn to wait outside for a moment. She protested, of course, because control was her oxygen, but he insisted, citing hospital policy. She left reluctantly, and the door clicked shut. That silence was the first breath of freedom I had felt in years. Dr. Brooks looked at me and said, "Maya, we need to talk about these results." His voice was careful measured, as if each word carried the weight of consequence. He explained that the developmental measurements of the baby did not align with the dates my family had reported. He mentioned the mandated report attached to my file and how it referenced prior injuries. Then he said something that made my stomach turn. The DNA indicators suggest the possibility of a close family match. He did not accuse. He did not dramatize. He simply laid out the science. My heart pounded and I shook my head as if refusing to believe, but deep down I knew the truth was always darker than I wanted to admit. For years, I suspected that Richard's interest in me went beyond control. The late night knocks on my door, the comments disguised as lectures, the threats whispered when no one else was around. Now the medical record revealed what I feared. The timeline did not fit Ethan, my former boyfriend. It pointed back to the same man whose voice had been recorded years ago saying, "Finish her if she talks." I wanted to scream, but I could not. Instead, I felt tears spill while I sat frozen on the table. Dr. Brooks did not push me. He simply said, "Maya, your safety is the priority. We have a legal duty to protect you." He called in Janice Hill, the hospital's social worker, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes but a firm posture. She sat beside me and explained the process. Because of the mandated report and the new concerns, they were required by law to notify protective services and potentially law enforcement. She told me that shelters existed, that safe houses were available, that I had rights. It felt like someone had opened a window in a locked room. At the same time, I felt dread. I imagined Evelyn pacing outside, Richard waiting at home, Caleb sharpening his anger. If they discovered what the doctor and social worker knew, they would make the words, "Finish her," come alive. Janice seemed to read my fear. She placed a pamphlet in my hand discreetly and whispered, "We can design a safety plan. You do not have to go back to that house tonight." Chloe came to my mind instantly. My best friend lived only 2 houses away, yet felt like another world. Janice suggested I could stay with a trusted friend under temporary protection while legal steps were initiated. My instinct screamed yes, but my fear screamed louder. If I left openly, Richard would retaliate. So I nodded slowly and said, "I need time." Dr. Brooks promised he would document everything carefully and mark my file for restricted access so Evelyn could not simply request copies. He said, "You are not alone anymore." That line pierced me deeper than the ultrasound probe had. For 20 years, I had been alone in a house filled with people. Now, 2 professionals were saying they stood with me. That knowledge was a trigger that turned despair into fragile courage. When Evelyn re-entered the room, her eyes darted between us. She asked with sugary poison, "Is everything fine?" I forced a smile and nodded. She would never suspect the storm that had just begun behind the doctor's calm demeanor. As we walked out, Janice caught my gaze and gave the slightest nod as if to say, "Hold on, we are moving." My pulse raced, my body trembled, but I clutched the pamphlet in my pocket and whispered to myself, "Finish her" was meant to silence me. Instead, it will ignite me. That was the moment I understood the truth was no longer just my burden. It was evidence. And evidence could topple the empire my father thought was indestructible. That night, the walls of the Dawson house felt closer than ever, as if the plaster itself leaned in to listen. We returned from the hospital in silence, but I could feel my mother's suspicion burning beside me in the car. Evelyn hated when she was not the one controlling a conversation. When she asked what the doctor said, I told her it was routine, that everything looked fine. My voice was steady, but my stomach twisted, because I knew she did not believe me. At dinner, Richard sat at the head of the table, Caleb to his right, Evelyn to his left, and me positioned where every eye could see me. They grilled me with questions. Richard's tone was flat, but dangerous. He asked, "Did Dr. Brooks say anything unusual?" I shook my head. Caleb leaned forward and sneered. "You are hiding something." He reached across the table, grabbed my wrist and squeezed until I gasped. Evelyn did not flinch. She sliced her food neatly and said in a voice colder than ice, "You will not shame us, Maya." My chest tightened and I felt panic pressing down, but I forced myself to lower my gaze and murmur, "Nothing happened." Richard studied me with eyes like steel and finally said, We will find out." His words were both promise and threat. After dinner, Caleb cornered me in the hallway. He shoved me against the wall hard enough to rattle picture frames. "Tell us what the doctor said, or I will make you regret it." His breath reeked of beer, and his grip on my shoulder dug into bone. I whispered, "Please let me go." He smirked and pushed harder until I winced. Evelyn appeared at the top of the stairs, looked down and said flatly, "Teach her a lesson if she lies." Those words sliced through me more than Caleb's shove. A mother should protect, but Evelyn was a partner in cruelty. I forced myself to stay limp, to look submissive. Inside my mind, a new determination sparked. I remembered what Janice the social worker had said about evidence. I slid my phone from my pocket and pressed record while Caleb's threats spilled out. I let him hiss into my ear about how I belonged to the family, how I would never escape, how the baby was property of the Dawsons. Every word burned, but every word became proof. Later in my room, I locked the door and played the recording back in a whisper of triumph. For the first time, the abuse was not just memory. It was a file, a weapon. I thought about the phrase, "finish her if she talks." They had lived by it for years, silencing me through fists and fear. Now I would turn those very words against them. But to survive until morning, I had to play the obedient daughter once more. I lay in bed, clutching the phone, and whispered to myself, "Not this time." When Richard came to check if I was asleep, I kept my breathing slow. He lingered in the doorway and said softly, "We do not tolerate betrayal." My skin crawled, but I did not move. When he finally left, I exhaled with shaking relief. That night was revelation not just of their cruelty, but of my new role. I was no longer only the victim. I was the collector of evidence, the quiet witness who would one day expose them. I thought back to when I was 14 and Caleb had wrapped his hands around my throat until stars danced in my vision. Richard had stood nearby and said with calm authority, "Teach her." Evelyn had later told me, "You deserved it for embarrassing us." Those memories once crushed me, but tonight they fueled me. Every scar, every bruise, every threat would be gathered like bricks in a case I would build. Lying in the dark, I realized that the empire of silence they created was not indestructible. It was fragile because truth had already slipped through the cracks. Linda the nurse had seen it. Dr. Brooks had documented it. Janice had a plan. Chloe waited on the outside. All I had to do was endure long enough to reveal the rest. The house was quiet, but I knew tomorrow the war for my life would continue. Only this time I was ready to fight with more than tears. I was ready with truth. The next morning, the sun rose over Maple Ridge like any ordinary day, but inside me, a different light flickered. I had spent the night replaying Caleb's threats on my phone, listening to the venom in his voice, and each replay strengthened my resolve. At breakfast, Evelyn spoke in her usual clipped tone about grocery lists and charity meetings, pretending nothing had happened while Richard sipped coffee and read the paper. Caleb stared at me with a smirk, as if daring me to mention what he had done. I kept my eyes lowered, but my mind was already moving. After chores, I told Evelyn I needed to visit Chloe to borrow study notes. She allowed it only after reminding me to return within an hour. I walked quickly down the street to Chloe's small house where safety felt real for the first time. Chloe opened the door, saw the bruises on my wrist, and gasped. She pulled me inside and whispered, "You cannot keep living like this." I showed her the recording, and for a moment silence filled the room. Then she said, "We have to find someone who can help legally." She gave me the number of her cousin Michael Turner, a 30-year-old attorney who specialized in domestic violence cases. I called him from Chloe's phone so the Dawsons could not trace it. When he answered, I felt my throat tighten, but I forced the words out. "My name is Maya Dawson, and I need help." Michael listened carefully as I explained in brief the situation. He told me to meet him discreetly at his office that evening and to bring any evidence I had. That day, I began to transform from prey into strategist. Back home, I acted submissive, performing tasks quietly while hiding the fire inside me. When evening came, I told Evelyn I was attending a study session. She eyed me suspiciously but allowed it. Chloe drove me to Michael's office, a modest building near the courthouse. He was tall, with a serious expression softened by kindness. He asked me to recount everything from childhood to the present. My voice shook as I described the violence that controlled the phrase in the medical record. He nodded gravely and said, "Maya, you are not alone anymore. The law can protect you, but we must be smart." He outlined steps. First, we needed evidence clear and undeniable. My recording of Caleb was good, but we needed more. Photographs of injuries, copies of hospital reports, any written threats. He advised me to discreetly document everything. Second, he explained the process of obtaining a temporary restraining order. With enough evidence, a judge could order Richard, Evelyn, and Caleb to stay away. Third, he spoke about the inheritance left by my grandfather, a fund that would activate when I turned 21. Richard would likely try to seize it by force or coercion. Michael promised to file motions to safeguard it. Finally, he stressed that allies like Dr. Brooks and Janice the social worker were crucial. Their testimony could strengthen my case. As he spoke, I felt layers of fear peel away, replaced by cautious hope. For the first time, a path forward existed. But he warned, "It will be dangerous. They will sense your resistance. You must appear compliant until we strike." Driving home with Chloe, I repeated those words. Dangerous, but possible. When I entered the house, Evelyn immediately asked, "Where were you?" I answered calmly, "Study group." She studied my face, then nodded. Inside, I trembled, but I kept my voice steady. That night, I began documenting. I photographed bruises under dim light. I wrote down threats word for word. I emailed files to a hidden account Michael set up for me. Each step was a brick in the wall of protection I was building. For years, my family's power seemed unshakable. Now I realized their power thrived on silence. Evidence was the antidote. Evidence turned whispers into thunder. I looked at myself in the mirror, saw the fear in my eyes, and whispered, "Not this time." The planning phase had begun. The trap began with a smile I practiced in the mirror until it looked convincing enough to fool even Evelyn. I knew that to survive, I had to appear compliant. Michael reminded me that evidence without context could be dismissed, but if I captured them plotting in their own words, the case would become undeniable. So I waited for the right moment. That moment came when Richard announced we would have a family dinner Friday night to discuss finances. His tone was casual, but I knew it meant pressure. The inheritance fund from my grandfather would be on the table. They wanted my signature to reroute it into Richard's control. I agreed with a meek nod while inside my mind, gears turned. On Friday, I dressed modestly, avoiding suspicion, and slipped a tiny recorder into my pocket. Chloe had helped me purchase it discreetly. At the dinner table, Richard began with forced politeness. He said, "Maya, we need to ensure the family's assets are properly managed." Evelyn placed papers before me and said, "It is just routine." Caleb leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes full of threat. I swallowed hard, pretended to study the pages, and asked innocently, "What happens if I do not sign?" Caleb slammed his fist onto the table. His voice cut like a knife. "Then we make you." His words vibrated in the air, and I knew the recorder captured every syllable. Richard scolded him mildly, but not for the threat, only for losing composure. Richard leaned forward and said, "You will sign because it is best for all of us." Evelyn chimed in, "Yes, dear, we only want to protect you." I kept my face blank and replied softly, "I understand." Inside, my pulse raced, but I knew I had the proof Michael needed. Later in the living room, they whispered about strategies. Caleb muttered, "If she resists again, I will break her." Evelyn said firmly, "She will obey." Richard concluded, "We cannot allow rebellion." Each phrase etched into the recorder like nails sealing their coffin. When I retreated to my room, I uploaded the files to the hidden account. I felt both terror and exhilaration. The trap was working. Over the weekend, I acted dutiful, completing chores, speaking little. Evelyn praised my attitude, unaware I was collecting every shred of her manipulation. On Sunday, Richard invited business partners to dinner. They laughed in the parlor about contracts while I served drinks like a silent maid. Caleb brushed past me and hissed, "You are lucky you behave now." Again, my recorder caught the tone. That night, I cried quietly, but not from defeat, from relief. Their arrogance blinded them. They never suspected the quiet girl at the table was building the case that would destroy them. Michael reviewed the recordings on Monday, and his eyes lit with determination. He said, "This is more than enough to initiate proceedings. With Janice's testimony and Dr. Brooks's records, the court will see the truth." But he added, "Maya, timing matters. We need to reveal this when the impact will be greatest." He suggested a public setting where their influence could not hide them. My stomach clenched at the thought, but I nodded. He was right. A courtroom would come later, but first I had to strip away their masks in front of the community that revered them. That week I rehearsed every line, every look. I pretended to be submissive while preparing to expose them. The trap was no longer just evidence. It was a stage waiting for its curtain to rise. I looked again at myself in the mirror, and this time the smile I practiced was not only an act, it was the confidence of someone who knew that the cage was beginning to crack. The night of reckoning arrived under the glow of chandeliers in the Dawson home, where guests gathered for what Richard called a celebration of community success. Local politicians, business leaders, and church elders filled the grand dining room, sipping wine and praising the family that had long been considered flawless. Evelyn floated among them in her pearls, smiling with the ease of a woman convinced her status was unshakable. Caleb stood near the bar, exuding confidence as if he owned every room he entered, and Richard moved like a king, greeting subjects. I stood at the edge of the gathering, my hands trembling, though I kept my face composed. Hidden inside my purse was the small projector Chloe had lent me. Michael Turner waited outside with 2 officers from the domestic violence unit, ready to step in once the evidence was shown. Chloe squeezed my hand before slipping into the crowd to watch. My heart pounded as I reminded myself that this was the moment we had planned for weeks. Richard raised his glass and began a speech about legacy and honor. The guests clapped politely. When the applause faded, I stepped forward. The room hushed slightly as people noticed the quiet daughter speaking for once. I said in a steady voice, "I would like to show you something important." Richard's smile faltered, but he forced a laugh, saying, "Perhaps another time, Maya." I ignored him and pressed play. The projector lit the wall with a scan of the hospital record. The words were there in stark black letters, "Finish her if she talks." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Evelyn's hand shot to her throat. Caleb muttered, "What is this nonsense?" I advanced the presentation to the recordings from our dinner, the room filled with Caleb's voice saying, "Then we make you," followed by his cold promise to break me. Richard's attempt at calm strategy and Evelyn's manipulative agreement echoed through the speakers. Silence fell heavy after the clips ended. The faces of the guests shifted from admiration to horror. One politician stepped back, shaking his head. A church elder whispered, "Lord, have mercy." Richard lunged toward the projector, but before he could reach it, the officers entered. Michael followed, holding documents. He announced, "These recordings and medical records have been filed as part of a petition for a protective order and as evidence in pending criminal investigations. The authority of the court is now active." The guests parted in shock as the officers moved to restrain Caleb, who shouted, "It is all lies!" Evelyn screamed, "She is manipulating everyone!" Richard shouted at me, "You dare destroy us!" His face turned crimson as the mask of respectability shattered. I felt my knees weaken, but I held firm. I said in a clear voice, "I am not your prisoner anymore." The words rang through the hall louder than I imagined. The guests watched as the family they once admired was exposed. One by one, they turned away from Richard and Evelyn. The officers led Caleb out in cuffs while Evelyn tried to cling to her image, sobbing to anyone who would listen. Richard was handed a notice of investigation and warned not to interfere. The reckoning was not just in legal terms, it was social. The entire community now saw the truth. No more whispers behind closed doors, no more masks. My chest heaved as adrenaline surged. For years I had been silenced by fear, told to obey, told I was nothing. Tonight I spoke, and the empire of control cracked open in front of everyone. Chloe came to my side and whispered, "You did it!" I nodded, but tears streamed down my face. The reckoning had begun, and it was irreversible. The Dawsons could no longer hide. The crowd dispersed in uneasy murmurs, already retelling the downfall of a once respected family. I stood trembling but unbroken, knowing that the path ahead would still be hard, but for the first time, it would be my path, not theirs. The morning after the public reckoning, the news spread across Cedar Falls faster than the church bells on Sunday. Headlines appeared online before dawn, blasting across local feeds with words no one ever expected: respected Dawson family exposed for domestic abuse. The phrase, "finish her if she talks," was quoted in bold letters, repeated by radio hosts, dissected by community forums. My phone buzzed with messages from classmates I had not spoken to in years, all of them shocked, many of them supportive. Some admitted they had always suspected something was wrong behind the Dawson walls. For Richard, the dominoes began falling immediately. The contracts his company relied on were suspended pending investigation. Business partners withdrew quietly at first, then publicly eager to avoid the stain of scandal. At the same time, the officers who had escorted Caleb out returned with a warrant to seize his personal devices. They found threatening messages, photographs, and financial documents linking him to Richard's coercive plans. Caleb, once the golden son who coached Little League, now sat in a cell raging at betrayal that was only his own doing. Evelyn fared no better. Neighbors who had once admired her stopped speaking to her. The women she lunched with on Thursdays resigned from her committees. Whispers followed her into stores, into the church, even into the salon. She called me repeatedly in those first days, leaving voicemails that shifted from sobbing to furious accusation. "You ruined everything, Maya. You are nothing without us." Each message I forwarded to Michael and to the authorities, each one added to the growing case. Richard's fury manifested in subtler ways. He attempted to contact local politicians to salvage his image, but the recordings of him speaking coldly about obedience and rebellion had already destroyed credibility. One council member said bluntly on the evening news, "It is clear the Dawson reputation was built on intimidation, not honor." That statement echoed what I had always felt, but never heard anyone else say aloud. Meanwhile, Janice the social worker worked tirelessly with Michael to ensure my protective order was enforced. Officers patrolled near Chloe's house where I stayed. For the first time in my life, I slept with a sense of safety, though nightmares still came. Chloe sat up with me on nights when I woke trembling, reminding me, "You are safe now." Each day brought another domino crashing down. On Wednesday, the IRS announced an audit of Dawson Construction after suspicious transfers were flagged. By Thursday, investors pulled out entirely. The company teetered on the edge of collapse. Evelyn attempted to rally family members to defend them, but many turned their backs. Even her own sister refused to host her. On Friday, Michael received confirmation that the judge had granted a temporary restraining order, not only protecting me, but also freezing attempts to transfer my inheritance fund. Richard's plan to seize my future had evaporated. Caleb called Chloe's house collect from jail, once screaming that I was a traitor. I did not answer. Michael told me, "The less contact, the better." His rage was proof enough of guilt. By the weekend, the community's perspective had shifted entirely. Where once people smiled at Richard with admiration, now they avoided his gaze. Where Evelyn once commanded rooms with grace, now she walked alone. Caleb, once a mentor to children, was discussed in hushed tones of disappointment. The dominoes had fallen in quick succession, each toppled by the evidence we revealed. Yet the greatest impact was not just their downfall, but my liberation. For years, I had been defined by their control. Now, I was defined by truth. That week, I returned briefly to the Dawson house, accompanied by officers to collect belongings. Walking through the rooms, I once feared I felt both sorrow and strength. The portraits on the walls seemed grotesque reminders of a lie. I packed only what mattered: clothes, journals, a few books, and left behind the weight of that house. As I stepped out, an officer asked, "Are you ready?" I nodded. I was ready not only to leave, but to rebuild. The domino effect had shown me that once truth begins to fall, it cannot be stopped. The weeks after the collapse of the Dawson empire felt surreal, as if I were walking through the remains of a storm that had finally passed. I stayed with Chloe in her small but warm house, where kindness replaced control. For the first time in my life, I could choose what to eat for breakfast, when to go to bed, even what music to listen to without someone hovering over me. At first, the freedom felt foreign. I would wake at night expecting Evelyn to burst through the door or Caleb to yank me from bed. But slowly I began to believe the silence was safety, not threat. Janice visited often, checking my emotional state and connecting me with a counselor experienced in trauma. The sessions were difficult. I cried, remembering nights of terror, the bruises, the constant surveillance. Yet each tear was release. Michael Turner pursued the legal front with precision. He filed motions to safeguard my inheritance, ensuring Richard could not touch the funds left by my grandfather. The court approved temporary guardianship of those assets with Michael as trustee until I turned 21. It was a victory that gave me a glimpse of independence. The restraining order remained in effect, and officers continued to monitor. Richard attempted to challenge the order, but his credibility was gone. Each hearing revealed more evidence of his coercion. Caleb remained behind bars awaiting trial for assault and intimidation. Evelyn, though not charged with violent crimes, faced civil suits and social exile. She sent letters pleading for forgiveness mixed with bitter accusations. I read none of them beyond the first lines. I gave them to Michael for evidence. My focus turned inward. Pregnancy advanced, and I prepared for motherhood with Chloe by my side. When labor began on a cold December night, Chloe rushed me to the hospital. Fear tried to creep in memories of hospital visits that ended in threats, but this time the staff surrounded me with compassion. Hours later, I held my daughter in trembling arms. I named her Hope because she represented survival after darkness. Tears filled my eyes as I whispered, "You will never grow up in chains." The nurses smiled, and Chloe squeezed my hand. In that moment, the pain of the past dimmed under the light of new life. Raising Hope was not easy. Sleepless nights, endless feeding, and the weight of responsibility often overwhelmed me. Yet each time she looked at me with wide, trusting eyes, I knew the struggle was worth it. The community surprised me too. Donations poured in from neighbors, classmates, even strangers who read about the case. They organized a fund called the Hope Fund to support victims of domestic violence. They said my courage inspired them. I had never thought of myself as brave, only desperate, but their words gave me strength. I enrolled in community college courses part-time with Chloe babysitting Hope when classes ran late. Studying felt like reclaiming a piece of the life Richard had tried to steal. I focused on social work because I wanted to help others trapped like I had been. Each lecture reminded me that knowledge is power, power my family could never take again. Months passed. Richard's company filed bankruptcy. Caleb's trial concluded with a guilty verdict. He received a sentence that removed him from my world for years. Evelyn moved into a small apartment alone. Her social circle vanished. People whispered when she walked by, not in admiration, but pity. I did not hate her. I pitied the emptiness she had chosen by aligning herself with cruelty. I poured my energy into hope and into building a future. One evening, I sat rocking Hope to sleep and realized I no longer trembled at shadows. I was no longer waiting for footsteps in the hall. I was shaping a home defined not by fear, but by love. The aftermath was not just survival. It was rebirth. 2 years passed, and the seasons of Cedar Falls cycled through snow and sun until life settled into a rhythm I never thought possible. Hope grew from a fragile infant into a curious toddler whose laughter filled every room we lived in. Watching her run across the living room carpet squealing with joy reminded me daily that survival had meaning beyond myself. She was proof that love could bloom from the darkest soil. By the time she turned 2, the legal battles that once consumed every thought had reached resolution. Richard Dawson, the man who ruled our house like a tyrant, sat in a state prison serving a 15-year sentence after pleading guilty to multiple counts of coercion and abuse, backed by the mountain of evidence Michael had assembled. Caleb, once his enforcer, was sentenced to a decade behind bars for assault and intimidation. Evelyn escaped prison but lived under probation after civil courts found her complicit. She resided in a small apartment on the edge of town, isolated, whispered about her pearls long pawned for rent. I rarely thought of her except when court notices arrived. The family name that once demanded respect now provoked pity or disgust. Yet I did not gloat. I simply acknowledged the truth actions have consequences. During these years, Michael remained steadfast, guiding me through hearings, paperwork, and custody protections. Chloe was my constant companion, becoming Hope's unofficial aunt. Together, we built a circle of support that replaced the one stripped from me at birth. I worked hard in school, completing my social work program, determined to transform pain into service. Standing at the podium on graduation day with Hope squirming in Chloe's lap, I spoke words that carried my journey. I told the audience that silence had nearly destroyed me, but truth had set me free. I reminded them that bruises may fade, but the damage of fear lingers unless confronted. My voice trembled when I said, "The phrase meant to silence me. Finish her if she talks" became my reason to speak louder. The crowd rose in applause, and I felt a weight finally lift. That speech traveled beyond the campus. Local papers quoted at advocacy groups invited me to speak, and soon I found myself mentoring other young women who carried hidden scars. Each story reminded me how widespread the silence was and how urgent the need for voices to break it. Hope was my anchor through all of it. Each time doubt crept in, I looked at her sleeping peacefully and remembered why I fought. I promised she would never grow up in fear. I promised she would know choice laughter and respect. One afternoon, as I pushed her swing at the park, a woman approached quietly. It was Linda Carter, the nurse who had whispered the warning 2 years earlier. She looked at Hope and smiled softly. She said, "I am glad you are safe. That record haunted me, but I am relieved it saved you." Tears filled my eyes as I thanked her. Without her courage to show me the truth, I might never have escaped. It struck me then that sometimes salvation arrives not in grand gestures, but in small whispers. Years later, when Hope asked about our past, I would tell her that her life began not only with my pain, but with my decision to refuse silence. Cedar Falls never forgot the scandal, but it also grew from it. The community invested more in shelters and support programs. The Hope Fund expanded to provide scholarships. My name was no longer a shadow under Richard, but a beacon others looked toward. Standing on my porch one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, I reflected on the journey. I thought of the lies that nearly buried me, the bruises that nearly defined me, and the threats that nearly silenced me. Yet here I was, with a child in my arms, friends beside me, and a future of my own making. Closure did not mean forgetting. It meant living without chains. The moral was simple, but powerful silence enables cruelty. Truth demands courage and justice, though slow arrives with weight. My story was no longer only mine. It belonged to every person who had ever been told to keep quiet. And so, when I looked into the camera during an awareness event and asked the audience, "Have you ever seen someone silenced by fear?" I knew the answer mattered. The comment sections filled with voices from around the world saying, "You are not alone." That was the final gift of my journey, transforming a legacy of violence into a legacy of hope.